For the last 16 videos, I've been analyzing and commenting on a video podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism that exemplifies that group's general claims that it's sounding the alarm over the decay and hijacking of the word autism, which was historically considered a pervasive developmental disorder defined at its core by severe communication challenges. But now, the autism diagnostic space supposedly is inundated with non-disabled quirky nerds who really should have been diagnosed with the now abolished Asperger's syndrome, with Asperger's itself, according to them, being a category of hyper-functional talented savants who are completely non-disabled, which according to the NCSA never should have been umbrellaed under autism when the DSM-5 was written in 2013, and believe that autism and Asperger's never had anything to do with each other. Certain friends and allies of the NCSA often say that the old DSM-4 got the autism diagnosis right by keeping autism as a real pervasive developmental disorder that was defined by severe impairments, that was kept completely separate from the trivially quirky nerds who were diagnosed with Asperger's, and that the two listing should have never been merged in the first place. Let's look at that video's description.
For almost all of its history, autism was considered a pervasive developmental disorder. Academic papers often had a simple shorthand for autism: devastating. But today, if you're quirky and anxious but otherwise completely normal, poof, you too can have autism.
Too bad for Jill and her friends at the NCSA that Asperger's disorder was already umbrellaed with autism as a pervasive developmental disorder that was defined by severe and sustained clinically significant impairments in communication, behavioral, occupation, sensory processing, and other important aspects of functionality, back under the standards of 30 years ago, which they insist got the autism diagnosis right. Now, it would seem to me that some NCSA leaders are making stuff up about the history of autism to justify their dislike of disabled people they personally consider the enemies of their own autistic children and patients, due to the perception that those who might have formerly been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome aren't suffering enough compared to their own autistic children to be considered disabled and eligible to access disability support resources. And that's just silly for an advocacy group like the NCSA to do, because making up things about targeted groups of marginalized people to encourage societal dislike of them is not what advocacy groups do. It's what hate groups do. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to part 17 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast, where NCSA President Jill Escher and her doctor duo from the Kennedy Krieger Institute, Lee Wachtel and Carmen Lopez Arvizu, are dead set on exposing what she calls high-functioning autism as a recent revisionist farce that makes a mockery of the struggles who have what NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel calls true autism.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Yes, true autism. A completely unscientific and academically unrecognized term, which Wachtel uses to differentiate her legitimate autistic patients from the high-functioning phonies like me, who in decades past would have never been considered disabled at all, let alone severely disabled or autistic, and that people like me being umbrellaed under autism and gaining access to special education and disability is a disservice to people like Jill Escher's children that's so extreme that Jill calls the presence of people like me within the autism definition to be a violent, radical absurdity.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu thinks it's fine for people to self-identify as neurodivergent, since we all have our little quirks and differences, but claiming that to be autism is taking it to unreasonable extremes according to her, since terms like autism are needed by parents and professional caretakers that use it for their children and patients to access disability support services and special education.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or letting themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Many supporters of this point of view use statements like Lee's and Carmen's and Jill's as proof that the DSM-5 of 2013 needs to be revised to undo the mistake in which non-disabled people, like me, are considered autistic, and that people like me should really be diagnosed with the now retired Asperger's syndrome instead of being pointlessly umbrellaed under autism, which is an actual neurodevelopmental disorder.
You didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school and you had no support and you were neurodifferent. That means you have a different brain processor. So social communication, social language were painful and horrible, not your thing, and it probably made life horrible. So those people today are finally getting some acknowledgement, and I think that's a good thing, but I look at it as a different thing because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. You are neurodifferent, and Abby and people like Abby and Abby's programs were neurodeficit. Abby had 20 years of speech and OT and other services just to be able to talk like a neurodifferent person already can. So the answer is the DSM-5. I think the diagnostic manual the doctors are using needs to be updated and changed, and real specific language needs to be created so that we can honor everybody and get them the help they need, but it's not the same thing. Putting everybody on the autism spectrum to me is not helpful, and it's going to make everyone autistic soon, and it's diluted the very meaning of the spectrum in the first place.
But these people don't care at all that in 1994, Asperger's syndrome and autistic disorder were already umbrellaed under the pervasive developmental disorder subheading, which is now known as the developmental disorders section. And that was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. The defining characteristic of Asperger's syndrome, which according to these people wasn't a disability at all, was actually defined as professional observation of severe and sustained disabilities regarding social interaction, stereotyped motor mannerisms, and other clinically significant disturbances and impairments, as it was called in that text.
I'm just going to start off with a little bit of historical perspective. So I follow autism research very, very closely. I've been reading autism research like the hyper geek that I am since 2000, earliest 2000s. But if you go back into the literature, this is not hard to find. 1988, for example, Fred Volkmar in the New England Journal of Medicine writes a paper about autism, and he calls it a, quote, devastating disorder. But then you go like to today, and all of a sudden there's this quote unquote new understanding of autism. I mean, I can go on with dozens and dozens of examples to prove that autism was considered a very serious and often devastating developmental disorder. So let's fast forward. Here we are today, and we're in this mess where this one word is supposed to do so much heavy lifting that it means, kids like mine who are nonverbal and have capacities of maybe toddlers or preschoolers, to somebody who is a PhD, to somebody who is a doctor, to somebody who is a lawyer, right? To somebody for whom autism is a challenge, right? But not really a developmental disorder or neurodevelopmental disorder.
Given Jill Escher's dedication to this standpoint, that high-functioning autism is a recent revisionist concept that alters the true history of autism, as Lee Wachtel described in this podcast episode.
And that's not what Kanner initially described. So autism has taken
most definitely not.
I'm not saying. Unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in the 70s by Rudder, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
It sure would be wild if Jill totally changed her stance on the history of high-functioning autism if she ever had the friend of an autistic doctorate degree holder and speaker like Temple Grandin as a guest on her show, and someone that was friendly to the NCSA's agenda at that.
I've been around the autism world quite a long time. I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I would say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told the only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And I want to say emphatically, that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of, 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that, we're sort of saying, well, high functioning autism was missed. Well, no, not really. I'm not sure if we actually have proof of that, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just making a side observation. Now, how did you get involved in autism advocacy? Because here you were, this guy who found out he had autism. How old were you? You were
right. Well, I've mentioned
maybe?
this on every I think just about every podcast I've done. They've asked me that, and I've told them the same story. I was looking for answers, and
Jill, you have no principles. I mean, you do, but they just probably suck.
What about you, Mr. President? What are your thoughts and principles?
What principles? Did you understand even a single word of what I told you? I know what I want, and I take it. I take advantage of whatever I can, and discard that which I cannot. There is no room for sentiment or guilt.
Jill, I sincerely can't express with words how strangely transfixed between relief and outrage I felt. Having listened to the misinformation that you and your colleagues spread about the history and the clinical legitimacy of high-functioning autism in your other podcast episodes, only to then listen to you passionately make the case against yourself and establishing the legitimacy of high-functioning autism as a long-established element of academic inquiry into autism. Because that means you knew that high-functioning autism was a legitimately recognized thing for decades, even before Asperger's syndrome was absorbed into autism spectrum disorder in 2013, and that it was also a legitimately recognized thing for decades before Asperger's syndrome was even clinically codified in 1994. But knowing that, and in spite of knowing that, you said this shit.
She seems like a completely lovely person to me, a talented, creative person who obviously is multi-talented, and I would never give her a diagnosis of autism. How is it that somebody who is extremely capable, extremely competent verbally, competent socially, competent in terms of her functionality, I'm sure she is quirky, but why in the world does that have to be labeled autism? I don't get it. I cannot believe what has happened to this word. It is so utterly meaningless that, this highly successful, articulate person who's completely functional can adopt that term, and not a single member of the media questions it.
I don't give a shit about Sia, and the way she handled the public disclosure of her autism diagnosis was, in my personal opinion, inappropriate and gratuitously self-indulgent at best. But that's her problem to deal with, not mine to feign at punishing her for. But why are you, Jill, who's supposed to be an autism expert, worthy of dispensing and appropriating charitably donated funds to help autistic people, making it seem like Sia was arbitrarily diagnosed with autism for performing in weird costumes? Especially when, in part 8 of my video series, I covered how NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel's friend ridiculed autistic doctors who were the target of your disapproval by highlighting her own autistic son's interest in weird costumes as a demonstration of what real autism supposedly looked like.
This was an article that just recently appeared in the time between the lecture in the University of Iowa, which we all got a chuckle out of. And this is from Spectrum News, where physicians, so MDs who've been through medical school, residency training, and all of that, who report that they have autism, speak out against the stigma that they experienced in their daily lives. Jenny also had a comment to this article. Again, she was just sort of blown away and had to kind of make a joke that these children are so similar to her son, who had a conversation with his moose costume and then watched the Berenstain Bears before eating his 8th apple of the day.
If I used my own interest in weird costuming stuff to validate my autism, I somehow don't think you people would appreciate that very much. And I might not even necessarily have blamed you for doing so. But that's not what we're dealing with here at all. Can you understand the difference? Whether you understand that difference or not, I understand that the son of Dr. Wachtel's friend and someone like Sia have very different descriptive profiles and resulting support needs. And I personally think it's valid to discuss whether more precise diagnostic terminology could serve in clearly communicating those differences. But even with that being a valid point of inquiry, in my personal opinion, it remains incredibly ironic and hypocritical and concerning in relation to your intentions that in the case of the National Council on Severe Autism, we now have a situation where in one NCSA video, a profoundly autistic person who is the son of an NCSA ally has his interest in eccentric costumes used as proof of how sincerely disabled they are, while in a different NCSA video, in the case of a person who was reportedly diagnosed with high-functioning autism who is not a friend of the NCSA, the president of the organization argued that the person in question wrongfully received that diagnosis in part due to her wearing eccentric costumes, and the NCSA president used that as proof that totally non-disabled people who have no characteristics of impairment or challenges in functionality are getting autism diagnosis on the basis of being benignly quirky. It's like the NCSA wants specific characteristics to be proof of what Wachtel calls true autism, until those things also appear in descriptions of high-functioning autistic people, in which case those same things can be used as proof of how implicitly untrue or false those people's autistic characteristics clearly must be. Now, discarding the personality of Sia from the equation, do you realize, Jill, that your description of someone you never met as being articulate is the type of fake-claiming logic already being levied against people who needed years of speech therapy and other supports and now talk with minimal obvious sign of impairment or added difficulty, only to be called disability fakers when they share information about their background.
You didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school and you had no support and you were neurodifferent. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. You are neurodifferent, and Abby and people like Abby and Abby's programs were neurodeficit. Abby had 20 years of speech and OT and other services just to be able to talk like a neurodifferent person already can.
Jill, the person who said that seems to agree with you on autism and who should and shouldn't be considered autistic. But that specific woman saying that is creating an atmosphere in which her own autistic daughter has been publicly challenged as an attention-seeking liar on the basis that her daughter, who became a social media celebrity after a reality TV dating show appearance, seems quote-unquote too normal to be autistic, with that ability to function in the non-disabled world being something that her own daughter struggled for years to attain, and was able to do so thanks to her having been diagnosed with autism to begin with. Misunderstandings about disability like these are creating a zeitgeist in which successful application of therapeutic and pharmaceutical solutions for disabled people is not used as validation of those methods, but used as proof that the successfully treated patients must have been faking it to begin with. This sets back inquiry onto solutions for people with support needs that could be essential to breakthroughs that may someday open a path to better outcomes for those who today require intensive supports on an indefinite basis, or who are radically isolated in terms of communication that the non-disabled world can readily engage with.
You do have some people who are very quirky socially and have some slight sensory and behavioral challenges, and they might be diagnosed with autism. They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers. They might be married. They might have children, but they might be given the same diagnosis as my nonverbal children who can't read, who can't write, who can't talk, who can't play with toys, who lack almost any abstract thought. Yeah. So it's this absurd overbreadth of the autism definition. So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
What level of success are autistic people allowed to achieve before their diagnoses become invalid to you and the National Council on Severe Autism, Jill? According to your group's silly-ass Facebook post, the bar is set so low as merely describing themselves as autistic is therefore to invalidate their own diagnoses. That's not something present in any clinical or scientifically recognized description of autism spectrum disorder.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
You know what's really absurd? That in the same podcast episode and in the same recording session that you said that shit to the face of a high-functioning autistic person who was diagnosed in the 70s. You also decided to name-drop that man's personal friend, Temple Grandin, as proof that you were aware of the potential for scientifically recognized and formally verified autistic people to achieve relatively high levels of functionality or success in a form recognized as success by the non-disabled world.
I meet a lot of very, very high functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told the only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And I want to say emphatically, that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s.
And it's uniquely ironic for you, Jill, to use Temple Grandin as an example when she earned multiple higher education degrees, including at the doctorate level, even if not in a clinical context, only for you to allow your pal Dr. Wachtel to imply that the autistic medical and psychiatric doctors in the Spectrum News article you were all complaining about can't possibly be legitimately autistic on the grounds that they attended university, when Wachtel's own patients, the so-called truly autistic, can't, and that the idea of truly autistic people attending college was a laughable, absurd betrayal to the history of autism. That's bullshit.
In my line of work on the neurobehavioral unit over the 20 years that I've been in the field, autism still represents individuals who are very impaired, the vast majority of whom have concomitant intellectual disability, minimal to no language, very significant comorbidities, whether those are psychiatric, medical, genetic, or combined, and who are going to require significant supports for the rest of their life, will never live independently, earn a living wage, run for office, drive a car, do any of those things, and certainly not attend university. And they're also able to achieve so many more things. I mean, just thinking about somebody who's been through medical school, that means that they succeeded at a very high level throughout their secondary education. They succeeded at a high level in college, and then they went on to medical school. They completed a residency. They functioned and succeeded at an extremely high level. They can't dress themselves. They can't toilet themselves. They cannot make any type of decisions. Maybe they can choose between having a vanilla and a strawberry ice cream. They can't live independently. They're never going to be able to do any of those things that these other individuals, like physicians who claim they have autism, can do. I mean, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on the neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about like running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
You may not have said that yourself, Jill, but you didn't challenge Dr. Wachtel at all when she said that, and you went along with everything she said and added to it and supported it with your own comments.
Well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on the neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about like running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I mean, I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever. Who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Kind of saying that we're not treating them with dignity, we're not treating them with respect, we're disparaging them, when all we're doing is communicating their reality. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people.
Jill, for someone who holds self-diagnosis of autism in contempt on the basis that these people don't have medical credentials to make these claims, it's incredibly ironic that you go around saying that you don't see a speck of autism in people that you never fucking met when you aren't a fucking doctor yourself. And I mean, yeah, and the sentence in that last clip of yours, you went on to make a passing statement, a passing mention to some other different autistic doctors than the one in the Spectrum News article, who you intentionally decided not to specify, but you still described those people as being included in the doctors from the article, in the sense that, in your opinion, there is no way they could be autistic, in spite of the fact that the article's narrative revolved around the fact that the people in question were clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and other disabilities.
They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And here we are told, when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old. When Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism,
The fact that I've used you, Jill, as my primary source throughout this video series as to why high-functioning autism isn't recently concocted revisionist nonsense against your claims that high-functioning autism is recently concocted revisionist nonsense is more than enough to warrant further questioning. Because in one moment with you, Jill, high-functioning autism is this newfangled insurgent revisionist debacle in which non-disabled people freely claim neurodevelopmental diagnoses to overshadow the real struggles of your autistic children. And then in another, you go into the history of high-functioning autism as far back as the 70s and described how concerned you are that there's this misinformation depicting high-functioning autism as a recent phenomenon. And you know what the difference between those two appearances, those two modes of operation for you is? In one episode, you're talking to a pair of non-autistic doctors who specialize in what they call the most severe autism cases, in which case high-functioning autism is this problem where you need to find a way to evict these irreverent non-disabled kids from the semantic space of autism. But then, when your podcast guest happens to be a high-functioning autistic person who's an ally of the NCSA and is associated with a famous high-functioning autistic person like Temple Grandin, your position totally changes.
But Tom was one of the very, very, very first autism self-advocates, and he had worked with Temple Grandin at Autism Society of America, and he had written books, and he was a speaker, and he was diagnosed as a child, obviously, as you can tell, a very different kind of autism than like my kids have, and that your kids have.
Whoa, where'd all the animosity go, Jill?
And he had written books, and he was a speaker, and he was diagnosed as a child, obviously, as you can tell, a very different kind of autism than like my kids have, and that your kids have.
Here, you treat Tom with respect as a public speaker with autism, and you respected his difficulties and challenges, even when he's achieved things that may be out of reach for your own autistic children. But in the other podcast, when you spoke out against doctors with autism that were sharing their difficulties and challenges, you used the fact that your own children weren't able to understand the concept of a doctor to hold clinically diagnosed autistic strangers in public contempt for describing themselves as autistic.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird they ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right. So never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And here we are told...
That's incredibly nasty of you, Jill, especially given the fact that you're using your children's description of disability to hold others in contempt, while you previously had already used your own children in comparison to your high-profile autistic friend and organization ally who was a guest on your show to explain how autism could encompass a variety of profiles of neurodevelopmental disability, reflecting of autism's scientifically recognized status as a spectrum disorder. And there's something really messed up about Jill being highly respectful of people she considers to have very high-functioning autism, when the deciding factor is their friendship with the NCSA and their outspoken approval of the NCSA's agenda.
But Tom was one of the very, very, very first autism self-advocates, and he had worked with Temple Grandin at Autism Society of America, and he has written books, and he was a speaker, and he was diagnosed as a child. Obviously, as you can tell, a very different kind of autism than like my kids have, and that your kids have. But he definitely had a very challenging childhood, and he has emerged as an incredibly kind and thoughtful and caring personality in the autism wars.
Thanks.
Yes, it is true. It is true.
Autism wars. Really? The only autism war I see with you, Jill, is when people like you claim to be advocates to autistic people only to say this shit about actual autistic people.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
They try to deal with that with the levels, and it's not sufficient. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and the levels are helpful, but not. I would agree, it's not sufficient because there's just not enough overlap in terms of their clinical manifestations to warrant throwing them all under the same label. I mean, they should have retained Asperger's. Maybe they could have called it something else.
At one time or another, which might even extend to today, I perhaps may have agreed on that issue, which appears to be a key talking point of the NCSA itself. Whether I agreed or not does not matter in this moment, because I, nor any other disabled person, should need to acquiesce to describing our multiple clinically significant impairments using the approved terminology of the NCSA. The NCSA are not our doctors. The NCSA does not hold authority over us, and they don't have the right to accuse us of complicity, in Jill's words, of an ongoing violent radical absurdity against her two autistic children by not only our failure to be NCSA allies, but for our daring to describe ourselves using our current clinically recognized diagnostic terminology, which at this point includes people who were diagnosed as small children and are now adults who have known themselves as being autistic for their entire lives as the key to allowing them to access services they needed to attempt to integrate with the non-disabled world. Services that NCSA ally Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu accuses them of not even needing, and that they're interfering with those services by using the term autism and interfering with disability support services by calling themselves autistic, which Arvizu considers an extreme act of them taking that term from parents and doctors of implicitly truly autistic children.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Let's take a look at how the video description on YouTube for this podcast episode in part describes high-functioning autistic people lacking personal endorsement from the NCSA, including the infamous autistic doctors who Jill is so certain can't possibly exist in real life.
For almost all of its history, autism was considered a pervasive developmental disorder. Academic papers often had a simple shorthand for autism: devastating. But today, if you're quirky and anxious but otherwise completely normal, poof, you too can have autism.
Just compare that to the write-up for the video featuring the interview between Jill and the high-functioning NCSA autistic ally, whose name I will omit.
Name Redacted is an accomplished writer and sophomore at Stanford University who has written about their disenchantment with the neurodiversity movement. In conversation with Jill Escher, Name Redacted tells about how they were diagnosed with level 1 autism at age 18. After years of severe mental illness and failed treatment, they prefer the term Asperger syndrome. They found autism a useful framework to help them understand themselves and enable them to exit the hospital and enroll in college. And the first year at Stanford, they found camaraderie and meaning in the neurodiversity movement.
Hey Jill, I want to mention, as an aside, on social media, there are people who are outspokenly supportive of you and the NCSA who are also outspokenly opposed to the idea that an adult could be diagnosed with autism, especially a woman. And they explicitly complain that the idea of an adult woman being diagnosed with autism is a radical distortion of autism forced into the modern zeitgeist of disability by radical neurodiversity proponents with a woke agenda. Jill, in spite of everything, I have plenty of concrete reason to believe that you may not agree with that idea, and you certainly aren't personally responsible for the individual beliefs of every person who happens to like you or your group. But if you don't believe those things yourself, Jill, you need to stop and ask, why are the things your group is saying and doing attracting supporters who think that your group is somehow on their side in advancing these positions? Anyway, the autistic person who is a guest on your show has every right to describe themselves using language they trust to clearly communicate their experiences as a disabled person with minimal misconceptions, as disability is, at its core, often a matter of personal perspective. And aside from that, said person can be as dissatisfied with the neurodiversity movement as they feel fit. And you might be shocked, Jill, by how many of their points of criticism of online misbehavior by certain neurodiversity proponents I may even personally agree with. But Jill and the NCSA don't get to dictate that other autistic people must reject the language and terminology of their official diagnosis in favor of NCSA-approved ones as the standard that determines whether or not they'll risk being the subject of an NCSA public smear campaign if they so much as speak about their challenges using their official disability terminology. And that's exactly what Jill and her two doctor pals decided to do in their video, with their ranting and raving about specifically named high-functioning autistic people in their podcast episode. The objective fact of reality is, Jill, that your young podcast guest, she was personally examined by one or more licensed healthcare practitioners who diagnosed them with autism spectrum disorder level 1, that being what is often described as high-functioning autism. The same diagnostic range which you, Jill, called those belonging to it, in your exact words, perfectly functional and competent, but quirky and sensitive. And you then proceeded to perform summary retraction of diagnosis of disability from groups of people you never fucking met, without you even being a doctor yourself. Your autistic friend is in the same range of autism which you, Jill, allowed your doctor friends to describe as having self-adopted the term of autism as part of a fetish. An arbitrary claim that does a disservice to those with so-called true autism.
But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Cantor, when it was studied in like the 70s by Rudder, and I mean, all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
And then Jill's pal talks about getting themselves a service dog. And for some reason, Jill's okay with that.
Somebody who is truly amazing. I really mean this. One of the most intelligent people I've ever come across in my life. One of the best writers, one of the most articulate people around difficult social issues I've ever met.
So let's see. I was diagnosed with autism, with high functioning level 1 autism.
We'd love to have you in the field of psychology, Lucy. It would be great. And we can't wait to read your books on it. You're such a good writer. I mean, you know that you could have a career just as a writer. You're an absolutely brilliant writer. I mean,
thank you. I do love writing. I'm going to do it no matter what else I do.
Okay. Yeah. You promise me you're going to write a book about autism, any kind of autism. It's okay.
And I also am hopefully going to have a service dog sometime soon. So that should be exciting.
Okay.
A service dog.
Hopefully going to have a service dog sometime soon. So that should be exciting.
Okay.
What does she need a service dog for, Jill? For being quirky and sensitive? And I ask not because I want to challenge this autistic person's right to disability aids, but quirky and sensitive is what you, Jill, have called autistic people who are diagnostically in the same range of level 1 autism as your autistic friend, but who happen not to be friends of the NCSA. So Jill, maybe my R-word factor, as you put it, is too high for me to comprehend this. But I would love for you to explain to me, Miss Escher, how it's fair or reasonable that this self-described high-functioning autistic person can be respected as a guest on your show, with you encouraging them to join the American Psychiatric Association, while she discusses her plans to get a service dog, while Dr. Jahil Javed, a self-described high-functioning autistic person, clinically diagnosed, who was serving as a psychiatric doctor in the UK, can't even discuss her own experience as an autistic person without you utilizing the platform of your autism advocacy nonprofit to make Dr. Javed an example of how allegedly weird and extreme autism discourse has become, because this clinically diagnosed autistic person dared to call themselves autistic, while your own autistic children don't even know what a doctor is and what a disservice Dr. Javed and her colleagues are doing to the history of neurodevelopmental disability research and to the struggles of those your board member, Lee Wachtel, call as those who have true autism.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
I don't understand how Lee Wachtel somehow is a person of leadership in a hospital for disabled children, because her true autism phrase is not a medically or academically recognized term. It's her personal bigoted bullshit dressed up as expertise. And similarly, Jill, someone being your friend and useful to the narrative of your self-created organization is not the dividing line between someone's disability status being true or untrue. As for your autistic podcast guest, who you carelessly use as a plinth for your agenda, I hope they got that service dog and pursued a course of study and a long-term career path that's working out great for them. But as a fellow disabled person who got serious pushback in higher education, going as far as literal sabotage and document fraud being committed against me as retaliation for me attempting to access my own formally prescribed disability accommodations that were far less invasive and less likely to attract unwanted attention and hostile misunderstanding from non-disabled people as having a service dog would have been. I deeply hope that their experience in college as a disabled student was smooth, uneventful, and absent of misunderstanding not only from fellow students, but from professors and college staff members. Throughout my series, I've given explanations of some of the accommodations and services I required throughout my education and life outside of that. And even for something as simple as using a word processor for in-class essays and papers that would typically be handwritten, I faced resistance from a handful of professors even when presenting them with written documentation that I required these things and that they weren't an optional courtesy that they could grant or attract to me. In other classes, I was set up to fail repeatedly and was told to attempt them repeatedly and to pay for them at full price repeatedly, in spite of trying my hardest. And I was told repeatedly to study harder and stop goofing around when I was putting in more effort into the work and actually understood the subject matter better than the students who were actually goofing off and yet scoring effortless B's on their first attempt because the class was structured around demonstrating a typical student's way of engaging with those concepts. And even with the extensive formal documentation of multiple diagnoses being filed with the college's Office for the Distribution of Services for Students with Disabilities, starting my own diagnosis at a university when I was a small child, the resistance to the idea that someone who seemed as quote-unquote normal as me needing disability services was so strong that someone acting independently at the college's disability office decided to not only steal and destroy the diagnostic documentation I had on file with the college, but to create fake exit papers with my high school's letterhead, which said that I was not disabled and required no services. And one of my main special education teachers laughed when I told her this, because a non-disabled student wouldn't have been given those exit papers to begin with. So when I finally got sick of being stolen from and lied to, at the tune of years of my life and life-changing sums of money, and I started demanding answers from the college, that someone sat me down and presented me with those forged papers and lied to my face, telling me that my choice to self-identify as having disabilities didn't obligate the college to provide me with access to accommodations or services. Wow, I wonder if a certain autism advocacy group uses self-identification as an excuse to discredit and reject disabled people, even if they're professionally diagnosed, who they want to hold in public contempt as being unrespectable and not belonging in the disability community. Well, it looks like they specifically did that. Unless the NCSA somehow didn't want people to actually take their outspoken outrage towards self-identification of autism without professional involvement seriously, they now have zero credibility in even attempting to make that argument. I don't need to sabotage these people. I just need to describe them as they explicitly present themselves, and it's more damage to their credibility as a saboteur could possibly devise. Anyway, if I seem personally offended by Dr. Wachtel and Dr. Arvizu repeatedly responding to an article specifically about clinically diagnosed autistic people by criticizing them for self-identifying and self-diagnosing and gleefully adopting autism as an identity choice, as though their merely saying that negated the fact of these people's actual formal diagnoses. My college experience of having gone through exactly that is the reason why, and it's the NCSA who has no business in the disability community, at least not business in which they can be trusted when they reject or encourage doubt toward the disability status of entire groups of people they never even fucking met. Now, I'm doing my 17th video on this, and I have still yet to make any actual defense of the self-diagnosis of autism, because I not only don't need to do that to make my points, since the NCSA is just using that line of discussion as a distraction to feign legitimacy in the first place, but also, I refuse to speak as though with some pretense of authority on behalf of the experiences and motivations of the undiagnosed, and by that I mean people who have not or have not yet been examined by a clinician, but in cautiously considered good faith, believe that they may be described by descriptions of disability laid out in diagnostic literature. I won't speak for them because I'll never know their perspectives firsthand, but if the NCSA or anyone watching this video wants me to denounce them having a place in the disability community, you won't get that from me, and I'm not on your side. And forgetting all of that, this shit right here from the NCSA is so extreme that you don't even need to endorse or respect self-diagnosis of autism to understand why this is bullshit.
They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And here we are told, when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old, when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism,
And remind me again, what did Dr. Wachtel have to say? An immediate response to hearing that?
It's become sadly almost like faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. Autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way. And, you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have. And it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. And it seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Meanwhile, for Jill's autistic friend who supports the NCSA,
I'm very happy to be your host today, but I'm even more happy to be interviewing today somebody who is truly amazing. I really mean this, one of the most intelligent people I've ever come across in my life, one of the best writers, one of the most articulate people around difficult social issues I've ever met. We just start. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself, about your diagnosis, your experience with autism, your experience with neurodiversity, and then we'll launch into some questions.
Yeah, that sounds good. So let's see. I was diagnosed with autism, with high functioning level 1 autism.
Yeah, I wish you were on the DSM committee. I'm going to nominate you.
Working toward it.
Are you? What can I ask? What do you want to be when you grow up, Lucy? What are you aiming towards with your studies? We'd love to have you in the field of psychology, Lucy. It would be great, and we can't wait to read your books on it. You're such a good writer. I mean, you know that you could have a career just as a writer. You're an absolutely brilliant writer. I mean,
thank you. I do love writing. I'm going to do it no matter what else I do.
Okay. Yeah. You promise me you're going to write a book about autism, any kind of autism. It's okay.
And I also am hopefully going to have a service dog sometime soon. So that should be exciting.
Okay.
You know what? I really do sincerely hope that Jill's autistic friend never got any professors like Dr. Wachtel in college. Because if they did, and she had to walk into a class of disability bigot professors, I really dread the sort of negative reaction she would have had to deal with from an authority figure of that nature, especially if you had a service dog with you. In my college, I had to present each of my professors with a letter from the Students with Disabilities office that explicitly listed my multiple diagnoses. I really cringe imagining what a college student might go through, handing a letter to a professor with Wachtel's mindset, saying that they were not only clinically diagnosed as autistic in spite of being functional enough to attend college, but also that they needed a service dog for it. And I say that based on the sort of extremes Wachtel herself went through in explaining her concept of what true autistic people are like, and what a disservice high-functioning autistic people do to them merely by existing, going as far as to say that relatively higher-functioning manifestations of neurodevelopmental disability are literally scientifically invalid in regards to research into autism.
In my line of work on the neurobehavioral unit over the 20 years that I've been in the field, autism still represents individuals who are very impaired, the vast majority of whom have concomitant intellectual disability, minimal to no language, very significant comorbidities, whether those are psychiatric, medical, genetic, or combined, and who are going to require significant supports for the rest of their life, will never live independently, earn a living wage, run for office, drive a car, do any of those things, and certainly not attend university.
Yeah, I really hope the personal approval and blessing of Jill Escher goes a long way, at least for her autistic friends who want to pursue psych degrees and enter the DSM committee of the American Psychiatric Association. I wonder if Jill has considered that her young autistic friend wanting to attend college for neurodevelopmental disorders or personality disorders will put them within extreme likelihood of being under the authority of people who sincerely and unyieldingly believe that anyone who has true autism or true neurodevelopmental disabilities belongs in a padded cell and not in a college, and that if they can't function in a standard college classroom setting like everyone else, then they shouldn't be in college at all.
Will never live independently, earn a living wage, run for office, drive a car, do any of those things, and certainly not attend university.
Even people who very outwardly and obviously present to others in a manner that's understood by the general public to reflect some manner of clinically recognized impairment or deficit face backlash when attempting to access disability services, and just as often, those people face explicit disrespect and hostility because they present as obviously disabled. What kind of chance does Jill think her young, high-functioning autistic friend would have explaining themselves to an authority such as a professor, and that with a service dog at their side no less, if they harbored that deep of a preconceived notion about things that supposedly true or real autistic people would never be able to attempt, let alone exceed at? And I understand how Jill, or even your friend, upon hearing that hypothetical but plausible situation, might be tempted to think, aha, if Asperger's syndrome was kept separate from autism disorder, as was the case in the DSM-4 era, this wouldn't be a problem. But if you think that, you're wrong, because I was diagnosed at the effective 0 point of the Asperger's definition becoming available to clinicians in 1994. I had arrived at the university months earlier. It would have meant me being diagnosed with some form of autistic disorder, and I was literally a pioneering case on how to deploy the Asperger's diagnosis and formulate an individualized support needs strategy for it, which included years of extensive therapy and support and use of adaptive equipment. Yet by the time I got to college, someone at my college felt that someone like me getting the relatively minimal disability services I needed was so bad an injustice to people with more significant disability support needs that they were willing to risk their careers by being caught committing forgery to, and their thinking, balance the scales and set things right by making my life as difficult as they could and preventing me from accessing disability services and being respected as a disabled person. And Jill, the way this relates back to your young autistic friends and why I'm lecturing you about her is to hopefully get through to you that no matter how strongly you or your young autistic friend feel that it was an error to include the former Asperger's patients within the lesser support needs description of the current autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, the fact remains that changing the name of your friend's diagnosis away from autism spectrum disorder is not going to improve the odds of avoiding traumatizing scenarios of disability discrimination. It may be the case that precision and accuracy of neurodevelopmental disability terminology should be discussed and examined and challenged, with the hope that disabled people can be better understood by the outside world with fewer misconceptions and stereotypes. Perhaps paradigms may shift, or new biological distinguishing factors may be discovered and confirmed. I don't know the future. But in terms of improving the odds of a fair experience for disabled students like your friend and countless others who engage with intricately detailed complex subjects at a worthy level of academic recognition, even if their brains aren't like that of typical students, they could still need help and operating in a structure designed for the overwhelming majority of typical students. The answer is not going to be to change the books so that they can be officially considered to have Asperger's syndrome rather than autism spectrum disorder, because as I demonstrated with my own college experience, vicious bias and stigma against disabled people from outsiders who believe that disabled people should have no place in so-called normal society are going to exist whether the formal name of someone's diagnosis has autism in it or not. And what actually helps students, like your high-functioning autistic friend that you had as a guest on your podcast, what helps people like her is when disabled people and their non-disabled allies organize and come together to speak out against bias and stigma against disabled people who are striving to fulfill their natural potential. But for some reason, that idea just irritates the fuck out of you. Because when Spectrum News published an article that did that exact thing, it bothered you so much that you planned and executed a 40-minute indignation meeting with your NCSA board members and allies about how extreme and weird it was that these allegedly completely competent, overly talented, and totally functional people still somehow wrongfully received autism diagnoses, which should be reserved for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Neurodevelopmental disabilities that the people in question were professionally evaluated to have. Jill, you seem to think that the defining characteristic of neurodevelopmental disability is having complete inability to speak or read or write, or having a significantly low IQ. But a lot of people who have required disability services for decades had higher than average IQs. And I'm not even going to get into the debate as to whether or not traditional IQ tests are even valid. I don't even care about that right now. This argument, this whole issue is so far beyond that. Because, Jill, you allowed your doctor friends to make blanket statements about how non-classic or non-severely autistic people, as you might put them, don't require special education or disability services, and that their presence in the autism space disrupted access to services for those who they call true autistic people who really need it, and that anyone capable of grasping with vocabulary and concepts, such as the idea of a doctor, didn't belong in the autism space to begin with.
There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about.
None of that's fucking true. That's not even my opinion. That's just concretely scientifically wrong. And I barely even addressed the way that Dr. Wachtel presented this imaginary interaction between relatively higher functioning autistic doctors and Dr. Wachtel's own neurobehavioral unit patients, because she did that in a tone that reminds me personally of the way critics of animal rights extremism lampoon activists who pull absurd stunts, like when PETA tried to sue on behalf of an ape for the copyrights to a photograph that it took using a human photographer's camera.
Well, you know what? We're always short on direct care staff on a neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Now, I don't have time to deal with that shit show within a shit show, because you let Dr. Wachtel in particular make statements about the history of autism research that, to be overly generous, don't paint a full picture and leave the impression that high-functioning autism was only invented within the last decade or so for the benefit of woke activists who wanted to claim disability to validate an identity fantasy. And my putting it that way legitimizes Lee's claims more than they can possibly deserve. And you know it's bullshit, Jill, because when you're in a conversation with a high-functioning autistic person, you suddenly tell a completely different story about how concerned you are about the persisting myth that high-functioning autism didn't exist back in the day and the so-called classic era of autism research, where what Dr. Wachtel incorrectly called true autism supposedly reigned supreme.
I've been around the autism world quite a long time. I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I would say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told the only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And I want to say emphatically, that's not correct. I could think of 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that, we're sort of saying, well, high functioning autism was missed. Like, well, no, not really.
Jill, it's not difficult to focus on advocating for the needs of relatively lower functioning autistic people, as you call them, while not being a vicious asshole to people who you consider relatively high functioning autistic people. Yet you only seem willing to do that when it's momentarily advantageous for you to do so, or when you expect that people outside of your private NCSA clique might be listening.
What's with your shirt this time, Will?
Funny you should ask. This week's shirt is my Ascend shirt. It represents our group as Ascend itself. This year is Ascend's 20th anniversary. Tell us about the National Council on Severe Autism.
Sure. The National Council on Severe Autism is a new nonprofit. It launched in January of this year. That was created to help represent the voice and the interests of families affected by more severe forms of autism. So you might say, well, what does that mean, right? Well, autism, as we know, has a lot under its umbrella, a lot of different levels of functioning, a lot of different needs, a lot of different presentations, a lot of comorbidities. We all know that. And Ascend, your shirt, your organization, represents somewhat kind of the higher functioning end of that spectrum, where people tend to have language and be a little bit more functionally capable. And the National Council on Severe Autism is focused more on the other end of the spectrum, those who tend to be a little bit more challenged, nonverbal. They also often have severe behaviors and comorbidities that are less frequently present in other parts of the spectrum. So my feeling is that all people with autism need a lot of understanding and a lot of representation and a lot of support, but that the needs can be very different among the subgroups.
Tell us about your background on the autism community.
Sure will.
Jill, this is so fucking sad. Do you think these people at Ascend would have allowed you to promote the NCSA on their platform back then if they knew you'd go on to hold a public indignation meeting to denounce autistic people, regardless of their support needs level, who attempted to secure potentially self-sustaining employment later in life? That's literally a key goal of Ascend, and you used that very organization's platform to promote the NCSA upon its foundation in 2019, and to use that to publish messages that cause autistic people who are able to further develop their self-reliance later in life to be accused of falsely claiming disability. Now, Jill, I'm going to momentarily ignore the fact that you specifically only seem to like those who you call high-functioning autistic people, who are either willing to let you plug your organization, or are ASD-diagnosed autistic people who don't identify as such and want to reintroduce Asperger's to the DSM. And instead, I'm going to focus on the observation that your animosity toward high-functioning autistic people that you exhibit in other places, and the idea that they don't have struggles that constitute significant neurodevelopmental impairments worthy of considerable disability supports. All that just vanishes once the barriers between you and those people are removed. Even if it's just through a webcam call, you somehow have the happiest time ever when the barriers between you and so-called high-functioning autistic people are removed. While in this podcast episode, in which no so-called high-functioning autistic people happen to be present, you treat their mere existence and visibility as an act of aggression against supposedly true autistic people like your children, who you keep mentioning as though to imply that to criticize your ideals is to criticize the legitimacy of the struggles of your kids. Example: look how you talk about autistic stimming and possible lack of eye contact when no autistic people are around.
Look at me flapping.
Yes,
I'm
that.
so autistic. It's like there's no real like Venn diagram overlap between like my kids and these TikTok people. You know, if I'm sitting here right now like this, instead of talking to you, that's not neurodiversity, that's a mental disorder, okay? And there's so much trivializing of autism. There's so much sugarcoating.
And now, look what happens when a high-functioning autistic person is present as a guest on your show.
So please, everybody, welcome Morenica Giwa Onewu. And I hope I pronounced it correctly.
You're close. Morenica Giwa Onewu. Hi, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Don't throw tomatoes.
No tomatoes, no virtual tomatoes. We're really, really happy that you're here. As I said, this is sort of a first on our podcast. Thank goodness for Zoom and the internet for allowing us to be together here. Now, some of you know who followed NCSA, you will know that Morenica has not always been gentle with her opinions.
Wow, why didn't you talk to that autistic person, high functioning as you'd call them, who stims, when there happen not to be any other people of that description in the room? And by the way, everyone, this guest who was welcomed and invited on Jill's official podcast, she was an autistic IAC member, the U.S. Federal Advisory Body on Autism. She was talking with Tom McKean about building bridges of understanding between neurodiversity proponents and the parents of high support needs autistic children. And only a few episodes after this appearance, Jill and NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel accused that former guest's committee of being stacked with high-functioning fake autistic people who were dominating that committee's roster and enacting policies against the visibility and support for lower-functioning autistic people.
And then you see marginalization, for example, on the IAC, which is the Federal Advisory Committee on Autism. It's heavily stacked by people who, quote unquote, have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. Yeah.
All when, at the time, only 13% of that committee's roster even described themselves as autistic in their official IAC biographies. So Jill, you fucking coward, why don't you make those accusations to her face? You had her on your show for clout and making the NCSA seem welcome of relatively higher functioning autistic people. And then, once she was gone, you and Dr. Gaiman Wachtel used her mere presence and a federal autism advisory board as evidence of a conspiracy of fake autistic people that were acting against those that Lee Wachtel said had true autism. And by the way, as much as Jill complains about the IAC, I guess somehow she's part of it in some capacity. Yep, there's her fucking profile on the IAC website. Either Jill was or is in some way part of the IAC, or she has some weird-ass Wario-type imposter using her identity to be part of a government body that the real Jill Escher says was stacked with fake autistic people conspiring against those who are truly disabled. Oh, and the IAC website lists Jill Escher's own Escher Fund for Autism as a source for autism researchers to go to ask for funding. But if your project doesn't turn up the results Jill's crossing her fingers for, she'll complain about you on her personal Twitter account, where she also likes to call people the R word, like she's a teenage douche bro in a Call of Duty lobby.
Oh my god!
I don't even care about Jill's IAC connections, because, I don't care in the first place, and the committee seemingly seems to exist in a state of suspended animation in 2025 under RFK Jr., and I never even fucking heard of this group until I was researching Jill's conspiracy claims, and I just think it's weird and wanted to mention that somewhere or another, since I did a whole episode about Jill's comments on the IAC, in which for some reason she never mentioned that she was involved and that they solicited people to go to her private philanthropic fund for autism research money. But anyway, Jill, you may not have figured this out yet, but I don't like you. And in my not liking you, I think of you, in some ways, like a dog. You are like a dog, loyal and determined, at least toward those you consider members of your pack. But in observing the manner in which your podcast episodes show you being kind and understanding and friendly toward relatively high-functioning autistic people only when they happen to be in your immediate presence, yet you're openly hostile toward people of that same description when they are absent? Well, there's a thoroughly observed and documented antisocial behavior in dogs that describes such compulsions, Jill. It's called barrier aggression.
He said it! He said it!
Barrier aggression is a phenomenon in which the mere existence of a barrier of distance or separation between yourself and others triggers you to perceive them as enemies and respond to their existence with hostility, only for you to be indifferent toward them, or even friendly toward them, once that barrier is removed. By your own description, Jill, you have participated in programs that exist relatively higher functioning autistic students on college campuses, and you've interviewed at least 3 different high functioning autistic people on your podcast that you've gotten along fine with. You respect them, you take their struggles seriously, and you take their support needs seriously when you're around them. Blog posts you've written on the NCSA website reflect an attitude that autistic people outside of what you call the severe category shouldn't be excluded from the disability conversation, even if your organization focuses on advancing awareness and solution for those autistic people in need of the most complex and resource-intensive supports. But based on what you said yourself and what you allowed to be said, without any sort of protest or challenge from yourself, and this single podcast episode, let alone others, paints you, Jill, as someone who sees high-functioning autistic people who describe themselves using their clinically recognized terminology as an antagonizing force out to discredit the struggles of your autistic children.
Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people.
And messages like the ones you and your non-autistic friends put in that podcast get passed around outside of the disability world and specifically cause people like your autistic friends and allies of the NCSA to be stigmatized for having received neurodevelopmental disability diagnoses and for accessing services that allow them to attempt to realize their potential when they otherwise wouldn't have been allowed to even participate and excluded outright just for being different from most people. And Jill, I know you can't stand it when sources talk about helping autistic people reach their potential, if that potential includes success that may be recognized as such by the non-disabled world, which may be out of reach of your own kids.
Working together, we can support young families as well as children and youth with autism as they transition to adulthood, helping each individual reach their full potential. Oh, thank you for the platitudes.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism.
Fuck you.
Fuck you. Fuck you.
Jill, fuck neurodiversity. Really, neurodiversity can, in all seriousness, kiss my ass right now. I did not create this video series because you failed to embrace and endorse the neurodiversity paradigm. I created it because you are the president of what's supposed to be an autism advocacy organization, advancing the interests of parents, hoping for better lives for their radically disadvantaged, isolated, and misunderstood disabled children. And as the president of such an organization, bearing such enormous responsibility, you and your non-autistic friends saw this article.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma.
And were so morally scandalized by the idea that a doctor could have a clinical diagnosis of autism that you completely ignored the fact that these people were not only doing nothing more than describing themselves using the current diagnostic language under which their evaluations were conducted, and ignored that they were doing so specifically speaking out against being stigmatized for having received those diagnoses while trying to function in the non-disabled world. All while you and your friends implicated said innocent autistic people of not only stealing disability resources from those who really need it, of not only disgracing the history of autism by frivolously claiming to be autistic, but of being part of an organized conspiracy against real autistic people. Jill, that's not autism advocacy. That's hate group bullshit. And I have a tip for anyone who might have donated to the NCSA in the past before they realize that there's reasonable cause to question whether or not it's an anti-autistic hate group. And that tip is that credit card companies and major payment processing companies have guidelines regarding the implications of tips and donations. And in most cases, these companies consider tips to be voluntary gratuities, which are thus non-refundable. But donations, unlike tips, are typically negotiable in terms of consideration for a refund. You might want to look into that. Use the money to get yourself a cake pop or something. Just a thought. And now, having said all of that, and having explained Jill Escher's barrier aggression problem she has with autistic people other than those who present similarly to her own children, I could wrap up my video series in an upcoming 4-part finale, with part 18 finally examining the question of why Jill Escher might have actually chosen to get upset enough at this Spectrum News article about autistic doctors to have made a podcast episode about it in the first place. Specifically, why it was this article, and why it was specifically Spectrum News. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.